We had a residential school here.
Music has always been a therapy for me. Like when something happens in my life, I always write it down. And then
We were friends too because we both supported the same political party, Gilbert, my husband and I. Yeah. And when my children were in school, a teacher told us the two children in school who knew the political parties and names of leaders now was my son and Gilbert's daughter Angela. I said, you can tell who follows politics because their children knows. He was a very good diplomat. And I guess eventually, if he had lived long enough, he might even have become prime minister, which would have been a real blessing for us. Yeah. He was a wonderful man, Gilbert.
Many people wrote letters on why they thought Gilbert should receive this award for his many years on council. I think at the time he was 28 years. He didn't think he deserved it. He didn't want to go. He wanted someone to go in his place to accept the award. I think mostly because he was sick and was getting to the point of being very tired. It took a lot of people to convince him to go and do it. And so he did. That's what he was always looking for. Things to make things better for the children or for the elders. And he went out of his way to make sure when the weather was bad or if the power went out, which does quite often here, he always made sure that if an elderly woman like Mrs. Schuker made sure that she was looked after, went to visit her house to make sure that she was warm or she had a hot meal or, or took her someplace where she would be warm and would be fed. And so there was lots of things, his mind just was working all the time. He was a good man, but he was an ordinary man. That's what he thought of himself. He didn't think himself a special person or that he was so clever, and he didn't like anybody to put him on a pedestal. He, like this award that he won, he didn't think he was deserving of it. He thought other people should go and so it was a problem trying to teach his children not to put him so high up, But there are people today, Gilbert's been gone for 7 years now, And I still today have people come up to me and talk about him.
Every time was a new challenge. Sometimes we knew it would be very easy to elect him, and then there was times where we were sort of nervous that maybe he would lose the election. He won every time by quite a big margin.
Well, Gilbert told me when he was in Italy that in the little village that he was in, his grandfather was an anti-Mussolini man, and they had this ritual every Sunday after Mass. They would line up all the men in the village, and one of them was his grandfather, and force them to drink cod liver oil until they threw up. And that was part of the ritual that they had to go through because they didn't support Mussolini. And Gilbert, all through his life, was a strong socialist, and he was a strong member of the NDP party, the New Democratic Party, which is a socialist party in Canada. He actually ran for the nominations for the NDP. He got the nomination to run against, but he got defeated by John Duncan, who is actually now our present Conservative Member of Parliament. So he ran for Parliament, and he also ran to be an MLA, a member of the Victoria legislature, but he wasn't successful there, mainly I guess because I was his campaign manager and I didn't do a very good job because we didn't get the nomination, and I was very disappointed about that, and of course so was he. But he was always very into politics, and I guess that originated from his grandfather, who was a strong anti-Mussolini Italian man.
Gilbert was NDP and I was Social Credit, and we were both very strong in those organizations. And when he ran for the NDP, I was going to run for the Social Credit against him. But for some reason we got in a party one night and he talked me out of it and told me if I paid my dues to the NDP, I'd be a good member to support him. So it was just to support him I paid my dues. And that was a big mistake I made, because ever since that they've won a donation every year.
And that was a good example of how persuasive he was. He got Gordy, who's a staunch conservative, to become a member of the NDP party, which is a staunch socialist party, just because he was such a good guy. And politics wasn't as important as the person, and that's the kind of person Gilbert was. He was supported by everyone, and everyone liked him, and he did such a good job for Alert Bay that it's not surprising that he got supported by everyone.
Gilbert was a very successful at finding money and ways of doing projects that a small community with a very small tax income could not otherwise have done. And so he would lobby very hard to get funds to do projects such as the seawalls around the village, the little fences along the top of the seawalls, the lighting, the village square, the piazza, and many projects such as that. And one of his main goals was to create employment, to create jobs for people so that the community would stay thriving and healthy, with people working and making good money and supporting the stores. And he realized that without good employment you couldn't have a good economy for the community. So he was masterful at convincing people in higher levels of government to contribute money for such projects. And you can see his mark left all over the community, whether it's the airport or the tennis courts or these projects I mentioned. They're all parts of Gilbert's legacy that he left to this community.
The doctor at that time, he was actually called the Flying Doctor, and he and Gilbert and the council decided they needed an airstrip, and he got funding to build an airstrip, and later he got funding to have it paved. So it is now a paved 3,000-foot airstrip, and it's big enough for a government citation jet to come in here. So that was one of his achievements.
But he had his ways with government. He used to go on these different conventions and one another, and then they'd have their meetings, and then afterwards he would go out for a few beers. And Gilbert wasn't a real heavy drinker. He didn't drink heavy, but he'd get these guys half looped up, and then they'd make promises.
There was one time he went out with Alex Fraser to a pub, and there was a group of them, and Alex Fraser was the Minister of Highways at the time, and Gilbert was talking about paving, and Alex Fraser, after a few beers, he says, I'll pave the whole of Alert Bay. So Gilbert said, oh, just put that in writing, would you? And he got him to sign it. And then the next day he goes to him and he says, Alex, here's what you said. Oh, geez, Gilbert. But he got the First Street paved. He didn't pave the whole of Alert Bay, but he paved the whole of First Street from a ministerial grant. And he was really good at that.
He was honest. That was one thing about him. That was a big item for him, because he got involved in politics and everything, and you have to be an honest person for that.
Oh, I've known Gilbert since he first arrived in Alert Bay. I'm not sure whether he came as a fisherman or to drive taxi cab, but he lived here for quite a few years. And actually, while he was mayor, he was very supportive of the library and was very helpful for everything we did. Wasn't he?
Oh, yes.
The mayor and council, they used to make the decisions as to what to do, but I was in charge of making sure it got done. And of course the politicians came and went, but we went on forever, the administration. Except Gilbert, in the 18 years I was there, and he never people didn't even run against him, because he knew he was going to get in, and everyone knew that.
Approximately 30 years ago, our father myself, I think my sister Angie, I know my niece Nicole was there because Dad had her on his shoulders. Anyway, he said, come for a walk up here, I want to show you something. So we came up here, and this was all swamp at the time. There was no trail, it was just a big swamp in the back. But he had a vision. He said, what I want to do here is put in trails and a boardwalk and so on and so forth. So we walked through here, and it was just all forest, this part where it's swampy. And he said, be careful, be careful. He had my niece, who was 3 at the time, on his shoulder, and he was telling us to be careful that we don't fall in because there's a swamp here. Anyway, next thing you know, we heard a splash, and we turned around, it was Dad, and he was supposed to be the tour guide. He was the one bringing us on a tour, and he fell in, so it was funny.
Gilbert was a very passionate person. Being Italian, I'm from England myself, and we tend to think of Italians as being passionate people, and he was certainly very passionate. He used to get very angry when things didn't go his way. But when he was talking to politicians, he was also very, very persuasive. And even though the politicians were of a different political party, like he was a socialist, and a lot of the time when he was the mayor, the main government in Victoria was social credit, which is very conservative. But even though he didn't agree with them politically, he managed to stay friends with them, and they respected him for his views, and they used to fight politically, but they were good friends when they got together in the bar or later, and so on. So when we had his memorial service, politicians from all the different parties came to pay their respects, because he was a very respected person.
And we used to argue when he used to try to get me to do jobs that I didn't want to do. That he was a really good man because we argued and fought in council, and when we went out of council chambers and out and for our beers, there was no arguing or fighting.
We became good friends. We became very good debaters with each other. We were not always had the same point of view, but that's a good thing. That's a very productive thing. And Gilbert was he really liked to have a good argument, a good discussion about things, very serious. He was a very learned man, very well read, very literate man. And so he would love to have a good argument about something. He was not always all that good about losing the argument, but he really loved to have a good discussion, a discourse, a debate.
Gilbert and I both loved to argue, and we would yell and scream at each other, and everybody thought that we didn't like each other. And so after our council meetings, we used to go and have a drink together. But we just thoroughly enjoyed fighting and arguing and yelling. And when he used to get mad at me, if I did something that he didn't approve of, he always demoted me to being in charge of dog catching. That used to be it was payback from him. He would do that to me, so I got demoted a few times.
Well, when I first came to Alert Bay in 1974, we used to run a bath for the water, and it was cloudy, it was muddy, it was like you didn't feel like you could go into the bath because you probably end up worse than when you went in. But during the time that the next year, suddenly the water became clear and beautiful. Apparently the water that we used to have came from Vancouver Island from a dam over there, and it used to be contaminated with cedar, wood, and so on.
Like say over a beer in wherever, Victoria, wherever it was, when he conned some politician into drilling our well. Anyway, they came up and they drilled the well, and they were there for a number of weeks. And when they hit the water, it drove sand up the pipe, probably about 16 feet. And they bailed it all out, cleaned it out, and then they started to pump. And they pumped for a day, and then they put filters in it. And then they pumped for another 5 or 6 days, and they only got about, I don't think there was enough sand in there to fill a thimble for a sewing thimble. And that's how we got our water.
So in his travels, Gilbert met Liana Bolis, Dr. Liana Bolis, who was originally Italian from the same region. Later became a Swiss citizen. She's a very famous, was a very famous, world-renowned neurological doctor of neurology, and professor in a number of different universities, including the University of Beijing and Paris and all over the place. So through that connection, Gilbert met many other world-renowned scientists who he enticed to come here to do some of their research. So very, very famous scientists, Dr. Gerard Millot, Professor Gerard Millot was one of the lead scientists, and he's now the senior medical advisor to the Pope. So these are high-end group of scientists.
They anchored out here and did their experiments here. So Gilbert thought it would be a good idea to have a home-based laboratory.
we found some money and built a small laboratory on the dock so that these people could come, for many years did come, to do their scientific research, mainly on human aging and the similarity between the aging of salmon when they come back to spawn and die, and human aging in terms of the degenerative bone disease or endocrine system or Alzheimer's. There were some scientists looking at Alzheimer's. So for a small community in the middle of nowhere, some people might think, we became quite famous as a center of field research into important human health science.
Seawalls that we have in this town were put in as a winter works program for some of the unemployed people, some of the unemployed fishermen, and we used to have to come up with different names for seawalls, like scenic garden walls. One of them was a retaining wall, was different types of wording. So over a course of many years, we poured these seawalls, and that's what's keeping our little island safe. It's keeping it from eroding. So I was quite young and fairly naive in those days when I saw the cruise ships going back and forth past Alert Bay, and said to Gilbert, yeah, we should try to attract those ships to come stop here in Alert Bay. So I said, so what else could we do? So he and I went to our friends in government and bought 2 British Columbia. They were called BC Transit buses, and they were sold to us. I think that we paid $5 a piece for them, and I don't remember if we ever did pay for them or not. We got two buses, and then I sold bus tours to the cruise ship lines. Gilbert he had his bus driving license, so he became one of my drivers, and I had other drivers. Gilbert was kind of, in the end, became one of the relief drivers because he wasn't that great of a driver. Anyway, so that's what he did, and we had lots of fun doing the tours.
My big job with him was to explain to him clearly that we all needed each other, and the world wasn't run by Alert Bay or Port McNeill. Collectively, we had to have a group that would run everything, because we had challenges like better education for the kids, build a centralized high school because there weren't enough high school kids in any community, and so because of the central location of Port McNeill, Alert Bay could get a ferry, and a school ferry was created by the provincial government to run the kids back and forth from Santula and from Alert Bay.
Gilbert had a bad habit of smoking in the municipal office. The employees complained to me about it, and because I don't smoke, I did not agree with him being allowed to smoke in the village office. So I waited until he went away somewhere, and I was chairing the meeting as I was the deputy mayor, and we passed a law saying that you could not smoke in the village office. And Gilbert came back and he said, so he said, we're going to change that. You can't do that. I said, you're only one of 5 people. There was 4 council and one mayor. I said, you're only one person. You can't overrule us on that. He said, yes, I can. I said, no, you can't. And I spoke to many of the mayors around the area, and they told me, stand firm against him, Maxine, stand firm against him. I think they enjoyed us having our little arguments. And so he said, so who's going to stop me from changing this rule? I said, I am. He said, you are? And I said, and if I can't, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police will. And so he agreed that it would stand. And for many years there has been a rule that you cannot smoke in the village office. So that was one of our little arguments that we had. And I always remember our village clerk, John Rowell, saying to my children, he said, "Don't ever argue with your mother because you'll never win." and Gilbert, it's the way it stood. Gilbert did not win. It didn't matter what it was. Gilbert didn't win, and but like if he didn't win, he had ways of getting even.
Gilbert was a good guy. On a serious note, he was a good guy to work with, and he was obviously more pro-Alert Bay than anybody else. He was identified with that community and did a great job as mayor of Alert Bay, no question about it. And we had a friendly rivalry, but we were both immigrants. If you think about it, we started off the same thing. We came here with nothing, worked hard, and he was a very hard-working guy. He was a much harder working person than I was. He was a socialist because I just don't think he had enough understanding about how good it is to be a conservative. I tried to educate him, but he wasn't listening.